Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm an e-learning evangelist here with eLearning Brothers. Today, we're going to be talking about writing much more better, or how to improve writing in instructional design. This webinar will be recorded. We'll get a copy of it out to everyone who has registered, and we'll send that out in an email later today. We're also going to be posting this on our blog later in the week, so you can check it out there. If you have any questions during the webinar, we'll be ready to answer those questions in the questions panel, and I'll be trying to bring up your questions as often as I can, so feel free to use that questions panel as you need it. If we can't get to all of your questions, we'll try to grab some of them and list them in the webinar recap later in the week, or if we're really lucky, we'll get them into the email later today. To talk to us about writing in instructional design, we have Dr. David Christiansen, our instructional designer, with us today. Thanks for joining us. We're excited to hear what you have to say. Also, just so you know, one of the things we like to do after the webinar is try to follow up as soon as possible. Sometimes it's just to get feedback. Most of the time we would like to touch base and find out if anyone needs some one-on-one clarification about the webinar topic after the fact. Also, we're going to be giving everyone attending a free eLearning Brothers account if you don't already have one, so you can look forward to that. All right, let's go ahead and turn the time over to you, Dr. Christiansen, and I will make you the presenter. Looks great.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Dave Christiansen. I'm an instructional designer here at eLearning Brothers, and today I'll be talking to you about a topic that I've really been wanting to improve in my own life as an instructional designer, which is writing better content for instructional design. And so I called the title of this particular training, Writing Much More Better, just as a little bit of fun. I'm actually a teacher as well. I teach college classes from time to time, and I usually like to start off every class by telling them what I call an Idaho joke, because I'm from Idaho, and it's kind of a form of self-deprecation, and also because it won't offend anyone, because nobody's ever from Idaho in my classes, which is kind of odd. But to start off, I'd like to tell you a quick Idaho joke. In Idaho, what do you call an intelligent, good-looking man? We have a term for this in Idaho. What do you call a good-looking, intelligent man in Idaho? A tourist. I see Andrew's laughing a little bit. Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate that. So yeah, we call good-looking, intelligent men in Idaho tourists. But anyway, let's get on to our training. This is a topic that I think a lot of people struggle with is, okay, how do I write? And to begin with, I'd like to go over what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about how we can write less instead of more. How to use smooth transitions, how to avoid instructional design speak, how to use signposting, how to avoid redundancy, and then how to avoid bulky wording. These are things that I have struggled with as an instructional designer. And these are things that I've had other instructional designers tell me that they struggle with as well, because it's just like this particular cartoon from Gary Larson. I noticed that it's Herman Melville here at his desk, and he's writing the very first sentence of Moby Dick, chapter 1, and he's going through these different names. Well, if you understand what is the very first thing that he writes in his book, it's Call Me Ishmael. And yet here he is, he's already got writer's block. And the reason why I include this at the very beginning is just to show an example of the fact that it is very common for us to have writer's block. Even though we think, well, as an instructional designer, I'm not really a writer. Yes, you really are a writer. We are creative writers, every bit as much as Herman Melville or Tom Clancy or any of these other famous writers. We are also writers. And so writing much more better really is important for us. Oh, by the way, how did I come up with that title? If you remember Pirates of the Caribbean, Johnny Depp has a line where they're talking about the key, and he says, no, I have something that's much more better than the key. It's a drawing of a key. So that's where I got the idea of writing much more better, not because I'm using Idaho grammar or anything, but, well, I probably was, but the reason why we say writing much more better is just a little bit of play. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this first topic of less is more better. I'd like to introduce this individual to you, Richard Blanco. He was the poet laureate for President Barack Obama for his 2 terms. And I'd like to tell you a story about this less is more better. President Obama was going to give a talk, a speech, and he wanted to include a poem. And so he went to Richard Blanco and he said, I need a poem for this particular event. And it was such short notice. He only had a day or two to be able to create this poem. And so he said, okay, I'll do the best I can. And he came up with a 1-page, full page of a poem. And he handed it off to President Obama. And as he handed it off to President Obama, he said, President, I am so sorry. I didn't have time to reduce this. And when I first heard that story, I was like, what? It kind of takes you by surprise. He said, I didn't have time to reduce it. I didn't have time to condense it. He gave him 1 sheet of a poem, and he says, I didn't have time to reduce it. And that's one of the points that I want to make up front is less is more better. We sometimes get caught in rambling on and on and on and adding so much content in our narration and so much content on screen that the learner has to wade through it. If we would just take a little bit more time, as Mr. Blanco was indicating, to reduce, to condense, to make it less. That is one way that we can really help our learners to digest the information. And so I wanted to start with this particular story of Richard Blanco that so sorry I didn't have time to condense this even further, because I think a lot of times we do make the mistake of adding too much. Well, let's take an example. This is from a course, and I actually designed this course. I won't say who it was for. I removed anything about the client. But look at how much is going on in this slide. Now, I'll give you just a little bit of background on this. At first, when I designed this, it was a lot different. But the client came back and they said, oh, we want this to be consolidated. We want this to be consolidated. We want this to be consolidated, which is great. But look at this. And what I'd like you to do is if you have any feedback, that's what we're going to be doing throughout this particular training, is I'm going to stop and just ask you, what do you notice that's going on that should be fixed? So here's the activity. It says click each scenario to view its information. So there's 3 scenarios. Then click if the risk of material misstatement is higher or lower, and if it is a significant or not a significant risk. So there's 3 things going on this one slide. Okay, and maybe I kind of already gave the answer to that one. But I'm going to let you provide feedback if you'd like. If you don't want to, that's fine. But if any of you have any thoughts of what could be done differently, I'll have Andrew just kind of chime in if there is anybody.
Sure, a bunch of comments are coming in here.
What do you notice about this slide? And I may have kind of already tipped my hand, but yeah, go ahead, Andrew. What are some things that people have noticed? And then I'll go ahead and on the next slide, I'll present what I would have done differently or should have done differently. Go ahead, Andrew.
I'll try to fire off as many of these as I can real quick.
Yeah.
There's a lot of options for the learner, confused on what to do at first glance. Too much all at once, too much text. Each scenario or action should be its own slide, one person says.
Absolutely.
Lots of information, too much information. You could create this as a branching decision tree.
Yes.
Right now there are too many topics all at once right together.
Yes.
Far too much text, too many things happening. They're all along the same
it's
lines.
all along the same line. Yeah, that's the point that I'm trying to make here, is look at how much is going on in this one slide. Now, what I wanted to do originally was what someone had mentioned was branching. First, we have our scenario. Then we have them indicate if the risk of material misstatement, by the way, this was for an auditing course, yawn, right? And yeah, I did not help myself very much by trying to condense all of this as the client had requested. And so we have scenario 1. They're reading a whole bunch of information here on screen. That could have been handled, first of all, in narration instead. And we could have just had an image on there of a person or of depreciation expense. So that's the first thing that I could have done. Second of all, what someone had mentioned was we have the 3 different things going on when we should have only had one, and then the next, and then the next. So, for example, here, 3 scenarios, all on the screen at one time. A lot of text. That's way too much. Then look at the description. They're going to have to read through all of this when they could just listen to it. Same thing with this, the risk of material misstatement. Now here they're selecting it and they're getting feedback, but still that's a lot of clutter on the screen. And then the same thing with this last one. Now when you first look at the screen, it doesn't have the feedback, but it's still very cluttered with stuff. And so here's an example of where less is much more better. And so what I should have done in this particular case was, as a lot of people have mentioned, I really should have just presented it first. Here's the scenario, decision number 1, decision number 2 could have easily been fixed with branching and with narration instead of text on the screen. Let's take a look at a second example here. So this is plan reading for a particular transportation company. This was a course that I also did. And here I thought, well, let's do a knowledge check activity. Well, that's great that we have a knowledge check. So here we have the knowledge check on the left side. Then we have the feedback on the right side. Now let me open it up here again. So this is feedback. What could be done differently with this feedback? Let me go ahead. What are your thoughts?
All right, some thoughts here. Simplify, make the solution an icon. Let's see, it doesn't really stand out from the image. Content should be simplified so the learner can grasp the info easily.
Exactly.
Split this into separate pages.
Yes.
Add more contrast, make it a different color. I like that one too. Use layers, use less text, use a pop-up. Animate it to illustrate it.
Exactly. Great points. Yeah, so I can see a pattern here too.
Yep.
Yeah, kind of the same thing. It's just too much content. Now, to start off with, without the feedback box, it was probably pretty straightforward. And I probably should have removed the feedback box so that you could see what it was. Basically, it was just a map that they were looking at, and they were just calculating the distance between point A and point B on this plan. But the example here is, once again, look at how much feedback there is on this. Now, originally, see, and here's the problem that I had with this. Originally, I didn't have all this extra stuff. All I had was, this is the answer. Well, the client came back, they pushed back and said, well, we want to include this and this and this. Well, this is a case where we as instructional designers need to gently push back ourselves and say, and this is what I should have done. This is an older course that I did. Since these 2 courses that I've just shown you, I've learned that I need to push back a little bit and tell them, hey, your learners are going to have to read through all this and try and figure it out. Now, I really liked the feedback that someone gave where they said, show this visually. That would have been a wonderful teaching point to show this visually. And that's one of the points that I want to make about less is more. Using visuals, using simple animation is such a powerful tool. And we don't use it that much because sometimes we get caught thinking, well, I'm just going to quickly put this text on the screen. Now, another thought is narration. Less narration is also better. Sometimes we just need to divide the stuff into several screens and let them go from screen to screen so that they're digesting a little bit at a time instead of trying to read through all of this. If you read through this solution, first of all, it's going to take you a lot of time. And second of all, this could have been done in a more visually appealing manner. And so the lesson that I've learned from this and the other courses that I used to do is we as instructional designers may need to push back gently and say, this is our concern. Okay, so are there any questions about less is more before we go on to the next topic?
I'm going to give
Oh,
you
I'm sorry.
guys
I
a.
was cueing you, Andrew.
No,
So,
I'm giving them a
were
moment.
there any questions about less is more? And we don't
Sure.
have to answer
No,
them
there
right now,
are a
but
few
are there any
thoughts.
questions or any thoughts about the less is more? Because I'm ready to go on to the next topic,
Yeah,
but
this is on.
didn't want to go ahead prematurely if somebody had questions.
Sure. It says on the bottom where it states another way to calculate, possibly include a tips tab or possible solution on the screen to see this info.
Excellent point.
The,
Tips tabs are really great. Tips tabs, because it's just a little extra piece of information. It's kind of like a little bonus for them. And they'll also focus on it. So that is a great point. I really like that.
Another person quoted Mark Twain, if I had more time, I'd have written a shorter book.
Exactly. That's a great quote. Yep.
And
Less
then,
is more. Well, I don't like the statement less is more because it's really not. It's just some PR clever little statement, but less is better is what I would actually say, or less is more better.
one
So
other question that came up here is how do we define the necessary information?
that's a really good question. How do we define it? Now, one of the things that I like to do is I like to go over these kinds of things with the client wherever I have questions and say, you know what, this is a lot. Would you be okay if we reduced it? And a lot of times the clients come back and say, thank you so much for getting us involved in this. Um, and just to comment on that, with this particular client that you're seeing right now, this calculating distances for this plan reading course, that was something that did happen, was we have a lot more open dialogues with this client now. And I do make these comments to them. I say, hey, okay, I'm fine with slides 1 through 4. I'm fine with these particular slides. But you know what? For slide number 10, this is a lot of content. And I'm thinking that they don't need it because it's redundant or because we've already covered it. Or, you know what, I'd like to wordsmith this. And ever since I started doing this, the clients have always come back very appreciative of it. Or like what someone had mentioned, adding tips, adding extra little features that they can select. And in some cases, you could even make it optional to where they don't have to select everything. It could be something where it's click in order to learn new content, but that's optional. And so that would be one way that I've done that before. But I think the main point would be, yeah, open communication with the client and just let them know this is going to be pretty burdensome. I would recommend that we reduce it. And that's always worked really well for me.
We have one other question. Do you
Okay.
have a simple, specific technique that you use for reducing text?
Yes. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the future sections. One of them is to avoid bulky words. And we're going to talk about that. Also to avoid redundancy. That makes things less. Basically, I'm going to be talking about that in these next slides. So that's a great question. And a lot of these particular things, avoiding redundancy, avoiding bulky words, using simple transitions, those will help us to create less. And then the other thing would be visual clues, visual hints, visual, simple animations are a great way to avoid having a lot of text or a lot of narration. And we'll see some examples of that too. So good questions. Let's go ahead and go forward then. So I just highlighted that was the real issue. It was just too much content. Smooth transitions, not just from one topic to another, but from one slide to another. Now, transitions can be really effective, but a lot of times we make them so long and so cumbersome that that's where we end up getting more. But if we just use simple transitions from one topic to another, then the learner has some kind of cohesiveness. A lot of times I've seen courses where it was just such a big disconnect between the slides that ended up being just kind of, well, here's a slide, here's a slide, here's a slide, here's a slide. Well, how does all of this fit together? And that's where transitioning can really help. And transitioning can be some simple phrases, but it is also how we lay out the entire course. And that's the hard part. It's easy to just add a transitioning phrase, but the hard part is how do you actually find transitioning throughout the course? How do you be able to explain to the learners that this is all connected and this has really, I like to use the word flow. How does the course flow? And that's where transitioning comes in. That way you're not just getting piece, 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 but you're getting course, which flows. Let's take a look at this. Here is a sample from a course that I designed. And let's look at the narration here. So we've got the news, we've got the newspaper. They're going to be selecting on these 3 images to have text appear, which I would do differently. But let's take a look at the narration here. So the very first thing we see is we'll look at some examples of misstatements related to accounting estimates. We will also do this, we'll also do this, we'll also do this, and this, and this. Well, that's a lot of instructional design speak in the first place. I'm telling them what they're going to be doing. So what could we do differently here? Your thoughts. What could be done differently for this slide? This is the narration. Now, it's a simple slide, but the problem that we're having is just the narration is we're just, okay, this is what's going to happen on this slide. So any thoughts? What could we do differently for this?
Okay, so some of these are coming in. One person says use bullet points for the main points. Another
Excellent.
person says you can click on each section to learn about blank, 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 things like that.
Yes.
Your slide already tells 1, 2, 3, so let it and remove it from the narration.
Yes.
Smaller, more direct words in the narration.
Yes.
Mouse overs, pick one headline, not have a bunch of headlines.
Yes.
And don't tell them what's going to happen. Let them investigate it and let the instruction develop naturally.
Yeah. Let them discover the thing by selecting the different images instead of telling them, well, we're going to do this, 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 this. We always do that. You know, whenever we're doing objectives, same thing. Our objectives slides are always the same thing. Well, we're going to do this first, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, and then this and this and this. Well, there's a lot of different ways that we could do this, and I like the way that the one person gave the feedback is, hey, let's let them discover what it is. Discover learning is just so much better than just indicating what we're going to do. Well, here's an example of what we could do. We could add the transition here. There have been numerous major accounting scandals resulting from intentional management bias. So we're explaining it, okay? Now I could get rid of a lot of this other stuff. I could still get rid of the 1, 2, and 3, but what I could do instead is just say, here are some of the ramifications. Now select them to learn. So I'm using transitions instead to let them know that, hey, here is something that you need to know instead of, well, let's learn this and this and this. And so we transition using a simple phrase. I think I could even make this phrase, even this narration, even shorter by removing the 1, 2, and 3 and just say, there have been numerous major accounting scandals. Select these to learn more. Now they're discovering it instead of just, well, this is what we're going to do. Now we're using some kind of a transition into what they're going to be doing. We're introducing it. Okay, in this case, scandals. That's what we're trying to focus on instead of do this, this, this. I'm not focused on do this, this, this. I'm focused on the scandals now. And hey, you're going to learn more about these scandals. Okay. Here are some examples, and there's a ton of them. I actually tried to narrow these down because if you go online and look at transitional phrases for writers, there's dozens of them, and they're just very short and very simple. For example, as you can see, or upon further inspection, or instead of telling them what they're going to do, you could say, take a moment to do this activity, or this is an activity. Instead of mentioning this as an activity, here's an opportunity for you to show what you've learned. Okay. And as I look through these transitional phrases, I'm thinking that we could even use different ones that truly transition from concept to concept and from slide to slide. And so these are just a few examples of some simple phrases, but I think it goes beyond just phrases. I think it goes up on how do you set up the entire course? Is there flow? And that's the thing that I always look for. That's one of the check marks that I check off whenever I do a course is flow. When a learner goes from one slide to the next slide to the next slide, are they seeing how it flows from one to the other? And a transitional phrase all by itself won't be enough for that. It has to be more than just a phrase. It has to be flow from one concept, and that concept goes into another. And I was going to try to bring you an example of a course, but I thought, well, that's going to take a long time to go from, to explain 4 or 5 slides. But that's the idea, though, is to go from one slide to the next, to the next, to the next, and to have them be cohesive. That is where we use transitioning, so that they are connected and that you have good flow. Our next topic is avoiding ID speak. If you remember from the first Incredibles, the villain, he says, "Oh, you sly dog, you had me monologuing," because he was telling Mr. Incredible all these things about his master plan. And so, first of all, let's define what ID speak is. ID speak, the way I think of it, is it's like we're the villain almost, and we're telling the learners all the things we're going to do in this training. And I made a little joke here to torture them with their training. We're not torturing them. But the idea, though, is ID speak is that we're just telling them, first we're going to do this, then you're going to do this, then you're going to do this, then we're going to do this. And you tell them everything that they're going to be doing before they actually get to do it. And so we need to be careful about using ID speak. And it's really easy to fall into. Here is an example. Well, here's actually a few examples. Let me read these to you. How could these sentences be improved? So the first one, in this training, we're going to teach you how to read plan sheets. If you go to the next slide, we'll show you how this is done. Next, we're going to help you understand. To learn more about new road construction techniques, select the 3 buttons. Okay. What could be done differently with these 4 sentences? And if you want to just make a comment about one of them, how could we rewrite them? And I'll give you a moment to respond to those. And while you're responding, see, that's the whole thing about ID speak, is you're going to do X and Y and Z. Also, don't mention the word slides, because that's our little secret. That's an ID thing. We use the term slides. We don't tell them go on to the next slide. We would say go on to the next concept. Or hey, let's go on to the next feature. Or hey, don't say select the image. You could actually say select the learning procedures. So let's label these. Let's name these things instead of using ID jargon. Okay. Don't say select the box. Don't select. We don't want to say don't select the box. We want to say select the features, select the techniques, select, and we want to name these things. Don't outline the things they're going to do in procession. First, second, third, fourth. Sometimes, yes, we can do that, but not giving instructions. We're not making chores for the learners. We don't want to explain this as, okay, first of all, I want you to go and I want you to clean the office. Then I want you to take out the trash. Then I want you to do this. No, you just want to be able to tell them, okay, here is the learning. Here are the names of the things that you're going to be focusing on. Okay, so Andrew, any thoughts from our viewers about any of these that they could have done, that we could have done differently?
Sure. We've had a couple ideas and then a little bit of a controversy, so I'd love to bring that up for you. Okay, so the first thing is an idea is just do it. Don't explain what you're going to do. Another person says, in this training, you will use bullet points, give a catchy title instead of telling them what they're going to be using.
Yes.
Use a more active voice. Use the term let's or on the next page. In this training, you're going to learn how to read plan sheets in construction. Let's look at one common plan sheet used in construction. Let's see. Do you know how any of the following should be done? Things like that.
Yeah, those are good. Those are excellent points.
The conversation that I've seen kind of going on throughout the webinar is a little bit of a confusion. Do we want to be outlining what you're going to learn, and then here's what you just learned, and then at the very end is here's what you should have learned from this course, or do we,
for part of the
is it okay to do that?
Yes, whenever we do the objectives, then I think that's appropriate, because yeah, you're going to tell them what they're going to be learning as part of the objectives. And I think that's appropriate. But when we're just giving them instructions about how to navigate, or about what they're going to be seeing, then I
Mm-hmm.
think we do have to be very careful to avoid ID speak. Now, there are some courses, though, where you would break that rule, where you want to be very personal. Like if you have a narrator, then the narrator is going to say, well, I think this, or hey, we're going to help you with this. Then I think it's appropriate. But whenever we're doing ID speak, the most common error that I see is when we're giving instructions. Um, and so that's where we don't want to try to use those things like select the next box, or in this training, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, or on this slide, we're going to. So I really shouldn't say in this training, because maybe that's the wrong example, because that actually would be appropriate if we're using that as an objective. But instead of saying on this slide, we're going to teach you how.
So as far as objectives go, um, here's somebody's comment that outlines
Yes.
the question exactly. The old rules were tell them what they're going to do it, and then tell them what they just did. Or is it better now to just do it?
I think if you're going to use learning objectives, then absolutely we're going to do it. In a lot of courses now, the clients, I've even asked them, do you really want us to have these learning objectives? And so sometimes that can be optional. Sometimes you can present the learning objectives through an animated slide. One of the courses that I'm working on right now is with the gay and lesbian community, teaching nurses and orderlies how to interact with them. And for our opening slide, we incorporated the learning objectives into the actual issues themselves. And so we said, so-and-so has this issue. Do you know how to resolve it? Well, there's your learning objective right there. And I didn't say, hey, you're going to learn this and this and this. It was, hey, this person has this particular issue. Would you know how to resolve it? There's my learning objective right there. And I haven't used ID speak. I've presented the issue, which is also my learning objective. And so we had 5 learning objectives, and I tailored it around 5 individuals who are members of the gay and lesbian community who had issues. And do you know how to resolve it? And then throughout the course, we went back to these individuals, and now the learning objectives were personified. They were people. They weren't objectives. They were people who had real issues that we needed to resolve. So that would be just one example of how I would incorporate that, is personify the learning objectives, make them stand out as opposed to, well, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Instead, well, we're going to help so-and-so do this and this and this. There's my learning objectives. And I didn't have we never even had a learning objective slide. It was, hey, how would you help these people slide? So that's just one example. And that's a good question. Those are really good questions. So thank you. So here's some of the things that I just noted. We're going to, if you, we'll show you. See, once again, if you, sometimes we have to be careful of breaking the fourth barrier. That's where we kind of introduce, when I say the fourth barrier, you've probably heard of that before. Whenever you make a movie or a film, you don't want to break the fourth barrier, even though Quentin Tarantino does it all the time, and that's why he's kind of famous. You don't want to address the audience directly. And so that's called the fourth barrier or the fourth wall, because you're only seeing what they're doing. You don't want them to see what you're doing behind the scenes. And sometimes Quentin Tarantino will break that rule, and that's what makes him kind of a famous director. And there are exceptions that do exist, but for the most part, it's really, we're not wanting to involve them in our plan. We want them to be focused on the course and on the content. Okay. For the next topic, signposting. What is signposting? It's the way you let the learner know what you're going to be doing. It tells them what topics you're going to be covering, the purpose of the training, why does this matter? Okay, otherwise, it's just here's a slide, here's a slide, here's a slide. So signposting lets them know what they're going to expect. This is kind of like learning objectives, but it takes learning objectives to a whole nother level, in my opinion. Here are just some examples of that. We need to let them know signposts for these particular types of situations. Time for cause and effect. If we're going to add information, if we're going to compare and contrast, if we're going to present conditions or concessions, and if we're going to be offering clarification. These are some examples of signposting. And then I gave a few examples here. But basically, the idea behind signposting is that you're letting the learner know if you're going to be clarifying something. And you can do that very easily through just a simple phrase. You can also do that from slide to slide signposting. And this is more of it's very subtle. Signposting should be very subtle because otherwise you're going to be getting into ID speak, and you don't want to get into ID speak thinking that you're doing an example of signposting. And so that's why I gathered these together as these different types. Time, sequence. That lets them know that we're going to be presenting things in a sequence, so that there's time involved. Sometimes we also have to indicate that we're comparing something. Just simple things. These are basically just writing strategies. These are things that you would learn in your English, 101 class in college, is using signposting for narration mostly. And these are just a few examples of signposting. And I didn't want to go into too much about signposting because it is somewhat subtle. It's a very subtle part of writing. But I just wanted to give you a few examples of where we can signpost. Before I go on, though, were there any questions about signposting? I really didn't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I did want to actually just present it because it can help. Were there any questions or any concerns?
One question,
Andrew?
is this the same or similar to the what's in it for me, or would you use these, are these accomplishing a different task?
They're very similar, yes. At the very beginning, you want to let that learner know what it is they're going to be learning. In one of the training that we just recently did for a client, it was an instructor-led training, an ILT, and it's about training these individuals about some of their procedures. Well, what we did at the very beginning of the course on their PowerPoint that they're going to be presenting is we included a little joke about the elephant in the room. And there was a little joke about the elephant in the room, and we actually instructed their instructors to identify that, hey, the elephant in the room is this. We know that training can be tedious. We understand this. Now you're identifying the elephant in the room. You're letting them know, hey, we get it. We understand that this training can be tedious, but we're going to reward you. And that was how we basically ended up doing the course. Was we gave them rewards. We ended up using point system, but the whole idea though was that we signposted and we made things very clear. We added conditions. We added a concession at the very beginning saying, hey, we know this is, you're going to be spending the next 2 days with us. This is going to be kind of hard for you. We get it. We understand it. And we're going to try to make this digestible and engaging and interesting for you. And so it wasn't really so much about the actual signposts that we used, the wording, but it was the idea behind it. In this case, hey, we're addressing the elephant in the room up front. Another example of that would be, these are the different things that we want you to gain from this course. And we're going to be going through them. We're going to be giving you examples. That is an idea of signposting. Also giving them situations and explaining to them, well, now let's practice with the situation. That's another idea of signposting. You're going to let them know that, hey, first we're going to learn, then we're going to apply, then we're going to practice.
So that sort of answers one other question that came up. Just to clarify, are signposts, is signposting only to be used in the objectives, or can you use it throughout the course?
I like to use it throughout the course, yes. First, we're going to learn, then we're going to apply, then we're going to practice. That would be a simple way to do that. That way they know. They know that, okay, hey, I just learned this, and oh, guess what? Just as I expected, now I'm going to apply it. And then, oh, I just applied it. Oh, now I understand that the next step is I'm going to practice it. And so that would be another way in which we can use signposting, is let them know, hey, here's the sequence, here's the flow. Otherwise we're just going to be otherwise we're going to end up kind of showing random screens we could get caught in not having that connection. And that's where signposting comes in too. And it's also about flow. So signposting isn't necessarily the wording, but it's the approach. Learn, practice, play. That's another approach that we use all the time here at eLearning Brothers. Learn, practice, play. First, you're going to learn this, then you're going to practice it or apply it, and then we're going to give you a game, or we're going to give you a knowledge check. But they need to know that that's going to be the flow. And that's what I mean by signposting, is you're letting them know without using ID speak that this is what you're going to do. And to avoid the ID speak, instead of saying, first, we're going to have you do this, then we're going to have you do this, and then you're going to have you do this, it would be more like, first, you're going to learn this, and then you're going to have an opportunity to practice, and then you're going to have an opportunity to play. And that could even done very subtly. But as long as they know that that's the flow, then there's not that disconnect. How are we doing on time, Andrew? I don't have a watch.
20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay, perfect. This, in my opinion, is the most frequent and the biggest issue that we have as instructional designers is redundancy. We keep repeating things in the narration or on screen. Now, the problem with redundancy, the biggest problem is, first of all, that adds to our scope. It's very subtle. We don't even think about it. Well, if I reduced 3 or 4 words per sentence, that can have a huge impact on our scope. A lot of times we go over scope because we're just going on and on and on. Here's an example. Simple plan reading objectives from one of my courses. What's wrong with this? It's redundant. Where is it redundant? And I actually changed this. This was not what we actually gave the client. I changed it because but what would you say? Where's the redundancy? Any input on that one?
Yep. So these are coming in. Read. Interpret, plans, identify and interpret on every bullet.
Yes.
Just say in a set of roadway plans. Plans
Yes.
and interpret plans. Lots of repeats there. Word objectives are in it twice.
Yes. Yes.
1 and 4 and 2 and 3 are the same.
Yeah. Number 1 and 4 are exactly the same thing. Read, interpret, and relate to a set of roadway plans. And then I just said it the same way. Accurately read and understand features of. That's the same thing, but I just reworded it. Well, so now I've got a 4th objective, which is the same thing as the first objective. And in Instructional Design 101, what do we learn? Well, you have to cover each objective, right? Well, so now guess what I've got? I have an entire course, an entire section number 4 here, that's going to be probably the same exact thing as section 1. That is something that we just need to avoid. And that's the example here of the reading objectives. If you start off with, redundant reading objectives, or excuse me, learning objectives, well, now you're going to end up having a course that's got a lot of duplicity. I think that's the word, isn't it? Duplicity. Okay, I'm going to make it up if it isn't. The word duplicity or redundancy. It becomes very redundant. And so we have to avoid that up front with our learning objectives. And then the other thing here, read, interpret, and relate. Identify and interpret. Okay, we've got to find different ways to change these words. It's redundant. And another thing that we really could have done was, instead of just having objectives, plan reading objectives, we could have maybe applied it and said, given a situation, you're going to be able to do this. Given another situation, you're going to be able to do this. And so we make it a lot more personalized. And once again, like I said before, these learning objectives could be a lot more personified into, hey, these are actionable objectives. These are things you're going to be doing because of this course. So that would be one example, is if we start off on the bat with redundancy in our learning objectives, we're going to end up with a course that is redundant. Here's another one. Same course. I did change this a little bit. Take a look at, this would be the narration. Okay, so below, that's not text on screen, that's narration. Once again, boy, that's a lot. for something so simple as recognizing abbreviations, what could be done differently? First of all, let's just open it up. Let's take it beyond the narration. What else could we do with this? So we've got our abbreviations on screen. We've got this message. What are your thoughts? What could we be doing differently with not only the narration? You can go ahead and comment on the narration, but what about the rest of it?
All right, we've got a lot of good comments here. Put
Okay.
them together in a glossary that's easily accessible later.
Click and reveal. Absolutely.
Do a matching activity. Make it a game.
Gamification. Excellent.
As far as the narration goes, find a way to abbreviate your narration.
Yes.
Mix and match, link to a glossary of abbreviations, quizzing activity, click to download a handout for the abbreviations. I like that one.
See, and we actually did that with this course. We became so cumbersome that we finally had to go back to the client and say, hey, we really need to have them do some discovery activities. And that is what saved this course. The course was basically an hour and a half of training that was only supposed to be 45 minutes. We finally went back to the before we started developing it and said to the client, we really need to think of a different way to approach this. And so that's what we did, was we said download content as PDFs and complete activities. So it was a lot of application. And here's an excellent example on this slide as well. Abbreviations, excellent opportunity to apply instead of just, hey, here it is, and here's a redundant way to explain it. Now, what I identified also is in the particular narration itself. It's important that you have the ability to recognize abbreviations. That's pretty redundant. I mean, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? Do we really need to tell them it's important? I mean, it's in the training already. And so a lot of times we'll add things like that. And see, notice, well, it's just one sentence, right? Yeah, but if that happens throughout the course, your scope has just gone up, and the learner has to plow through all of this. That's the thing you have to understand too. The learner has to plow through all of this. And that's one of the reasons why the course ended up being an hour and a half, or they ended up saying, we ended up scoping it an hour and a half and had to go back to the client, was because, oh my gosh, they're going to have to sort through all of this content. And so we just said, hey, we need to reduce, reduce, reduce. And so for this particular slide, we did go with an activity instead. We just said, hey, here's an abbreviations. Do you know how to use it? Yeah, prove it. Here's an activity. And that's what we did.
There's another comment on the narration that says the second sentence can be removed as well because it's obviously a list of abbreviations.
Excellent point. Excellent comment. Yeah, you can find redundancy everywhere. Remember my first point at the beginning with the poet laureate. I'm so sorry, Mr. President, I didn't have the time to reduce this, to condense this. We need to take the time to wordsmith. And I do this all the time. And that's the first question I ask the client. May I wordsmith this? Well, the first question is, has it been through legal? Yeah, that's the first question, right? Has this been through legal? You know, because, yeah, clients all the time. Oh, by the way, we didn't send this through legal. So the first question, yeah, run it by legal. Okay, now, is this the finalized script? Yes, okay, great. Now, may I have permission to wordsmith this? And if they say no, yeah, sometimes I like to gently, and I emphasize the word gently, push back. And then I'll just show them examples. Sometimes that is the best way to educate a client, is give them an example and say something just exactly like what you see on the screen. I'd like to remove this because it comes across as, you might need to wordsmith the word redundant and not say the word redundant to the client, but you might say it does extend the idea. Okay, but there are ways that you can explain that to the client. And if you build a relationship of trust with your client up front, the conversation is not that difficult. So, avoiding redundancy, and this can even be done by just avoiding bulky words. Wordsmith, that's what the word means. Wordsmith, we're going to condense, we're going to chop, okay? Bulky wording, very subtle way to add to the scope. It's time consuming. It lengthens the course. It adds additional expense for recording. It also lengthens the time that the learner has to plow through the course. So avoiding bulky wording in the narration and on screen is very helpful. And these are simple things that you can do just by taking out the bulky words. And let me give you an example of a couple of bulky words. Okay, let's see if you can identify them. Take a look at these three sentences. All I really want you to do is just take out a few words. You don't need to change the whole sentence. Just remove words. Which words would, oh my gosh, excuse me. Which words could be removed? And I know some people think, well, you know, it's just not a big deal. It's just an extra word. Well, that's going to add up over time. Okay. I'll give you a hint. Adverbs are bulky words.
Here's a bunch of bulky words here.
Yep.
Basically, in order to, essentially, excess.
Yeah.
Let's see, I'm trying not to repeat myself here. One person says all the adverbs.
All of the adverbs. You do not, if you read books by authors, they do not use a lot of adverbs because they're good at what they do. They can describe something. If you, I promise you, if you look at a published book, you will hardly ever see the word very or really in their books because they use adjectives and they use good adjectives. And a lot of times they just use simple phrases, simple sentences, but they combine them together. And that's where the beauty of their work resides. It's not because they're going on and on. Okay. Well, here are some of the words that I took off. In order to. You could just say eliminate excess words to make your writing more concise. These extra words, basically, there's an adverb. Essentially, that's an adverb. Really is an adjective or an adverb. Actually and quite, those are adverbs. It really doesn't add a lot to these sentences, does it? Let's look at the third one. If you eliminate bulky wording, your writing will be better. To me, that gets the idea across just fine. Now, maybe I just use a different word besides better or be better. Your writing will be excellent or it'll be phenomenal. You could just, so we're using adjectives instead of adverbs. So that would be, and if you look at this, 3 sentences, well, 4, but we've taken out 7 words, that's going to add up over time. I listed just a few bulky words. Notice that almost all of these, I think all of them are either adverbs or adverb clauses or adjective clauses. In the process of, for the most part, those are adjective clauses. And we use adjective clauses to do what? To describe nouns. And sometimes we don't even need them. What do we use adverbs for? To describe adjectives and other verbs. A lot of times we just don't need them. If we focus on adjectives and using good adjectives, we really don't need them. So in order to simply using prepositional phrases in the process of, for the most part, using colloquial phrases, each and every, or as a matter of fact, those kind of things that we include, sometimes they just aren't necessary. Now, there are exceptions, and there are sometimes where you do want to, but for the most part, I try to avoid them. And when I wordsmith, those are the first things that I will get rid of, is really and very. And then I go through the rest of the adverbs. Okay. Yes. How much?
3 minutes.
We're down to 3 minutes. I'm sorry. I do this all the time with my students too. I mean, they're sitting there looking at the clock and I'm still going on and on. I just get really wrapped up in these things. So I think we can pretty much finish. As a matter of fact, I think we almost are finished. Is there anything? Oh, haha. Wow. Perfect timing. 3 minutes. So we have 3 minutes for any additional questions.
Now, there are a lot of
Yeah, maybe we could just do
questions
a few.
here.
Yeah,
We'll
I'll
just
let you
take a
sort
few.
through them, Andrew, and just if you see any that you think Try to pick the easy ones. Easy ones for me. Don't go into the hard ones.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, do the easy ones that I can answer.
We'll grab a few of these and then we'll do our best to answer these later today if we don't get around to them.
Absolutely. We'll be happy to.
Let's see here. Okay, I think we actually covered some of these. When are objectives needed at the beginning of the course?
Well, I like to always include objectives, but having said that, I like to try to create, like I mentioned before, I like to create the learning objectives as more learning tasks. I try to make them more personable. Instead of saying, in this course, you're going to do this and this and this. It's kind of like the example that I said for this training that we did for the LGBT community of, in this course, you're going to help so-and-so. Well, there's my learning objective, but I've masked it under a person and what we had these different people that were having issues that we needed to resolve. And so I do agree that we need that as a signpost as well. We absolutely have to have learning objectives, but we can be creative with our learning objectives. Kind of like I explained before, is that we can personify them. We can relate them to tasks at hand. We talk about using verbs other than understand or learn. Well, let's take that a step further. And in this course, you're going to help so-and-so. Well, there's my learning objective, but it's more personified. Any others?
We'll just take one more question.
Okay.
If you use less narration with on-demand or discover learning, how do you make it ADA compliant or ensure that it is ADA compliant?
Ooh.
Too hard?
Well,
pretend I didn't ask that one.
Well, I'm thinking of 508 compliance when they say that.
Right.
And I really think all you can do is just follow the 508 compliance guidelines using alt tags for the images, and then also, wow. Let's mark that one and we can go back to that one.
Sure.
Because that's a good question as far as, because I know the 508 compliance standards, but as far as, okay, how do we actually, as far as the narration and the text, just to make sure that I do give a good answer.
Right. Yeah, we'll get that one answered as soon as we can.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the screen back here, and I do want to put a plug here for ELBX. We are at 13 days away for ELBX. It is very close. It's our user conference, first one we're doing here in Salt Lake City. We're making it a part of Learning Dev Camp. Dr. Chris Jansen is going to be there. It's going to be great. You're going to also be able to meet Dr. Michael Allen, Dr. Carl Kopp, and of course a bunch of eLearning Brothers rock stars. So you'll want to check that out. But here on the left side of the screen, schedule a free demo. So you can give us a call at that number, and you can take a look at some templates, games. We have a lot of game templates that you can look at, cut out people, icons, all these kinds of things. But you can also schedule a consultation with our eLearning Brothers custom side, and we'd love to help you workshop some of your courses this way. So yes. Give us a call. We want to talk to you about this and continue this conversation offline, if you will. So thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks, Dr. Chris Jansen, for spending time with us today.
Yes, thanks everyone for your questions and your input. Really appreciate it.
This will be great, and we'll hopefully see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.